Hi all, welcome to MeDIDa, a podcast analysing all sorts of media about multiplicity and dissociative identity disorder. We're talking about books, movies, television, gaming, and more. Whether it's overt or covert, intentional or unintentional, I want to talk about it. I'm your podcast host, Avoticat. I am a fully fused system, which means that my multiplicity is no longer compartmentalized, and I'm constantly intrigued by the way that media that isn't intentionally trying to represent plurality almost always does a better job compared to media that actually actively sets out to represent it. This podcast is not necessarily a place that is here to educate about DID and multiplicity. If you want educational content, there is several other places that you can find that, both online and offline. But this here is specifically to review and analyze media. So if you, like me, have opinions on things, stick around to join in the discussion. Today, for the first time ever, I am joined by a special guest, James.
Hi.
Hi. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
So, I've known Avoticat for a long time, and we've been members of the same book club for a few years at this point. And, so I've got really quite into having discussions about books over the past few years.
Yes, we've had lots of book discussions. Would you like to talk a little bit about your connection or relationship with multiplicity? First question, are you plural or not?
I am not plural.
Okay.
So, best of my knowledge.
What do you know about plurality?
So, I've actually had a few close friends over the years who've had DID, and so I, wouldn't consider myself anything but a layperson, but I feel like I'm still maybe a step ahead of a lot of other people, particularly with respect to understanding this poorly understood and much maligned condition. Particularly as most people, don't see a lot of good representations of it.
I agree. So, before we begin, it's important to acknowledge that this podcast is being recorded on Kaurna country, and I extend my respect to the traditional custodians of the land and the elders past, present, and emerging. Sovereignty was never ceded. This is still stolen land without any Indigenous treaty. The land I am on impacts how I go about my day-to-day life, which includes media analysis. So this acknowledgement of country is very important to the work we do here. Particularly, it is pertinent today as the colonial history of this country is hugely relevant to the media that we're talking about, which is the Swan Book by Alexis Wright. Alexis Wright is a prominent Indigenous Australian author. She consistently receives critical acclaim for her books and I think has won a couple of awards. The Swan Book was first published in 2013 through Giramondo Publishing and was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award. This book is set in a dystopian future, which, with climate change and political fallout being central themes. So, James, would you like to take it away with the blurb?
Sure. The Swan Book is set in the future, with Aboriginal people still living under the intervention in the north, in an environment fundamentally altered by climate change. It follows the life of a mute young woman called Oblivia, the victim of gang rape by petrol-sniffing youths, from the displaced community where she lives in a hull in a swamp filled with rusting boats and thousands of black swans, to her marriage to Warren Finch, the first Aboriginal President of Australia, and her elevation to the position of First Lady, confined to a tower in a flooded and lawless southern city. The Swan Book offers an intimate awareness of the realities facing Aboriginal people. The energy and humour in her writing, which draws freely on myth and legend, finds hope in the bleakest situations.
Awesome. Do you want to give us a little bit of background about your relationship with this book and why you wanted to come on this episode?
So, I read this book via audiobook last year when we did our Australian Authors Month in Book Club. And I, along with Avoticat, found it really interesting and sort of dense and complex. And there's so much humor in the book as well, which is welcome but unexpected, given the very heavy subject matter.
Yeah, no, a lot of the comedy really caught me off guard as I was reading it. I'd find myself reading about like something absolutely horrific and then just the most obscure joke dropped in there and I would laugh out loud and it would feel very inappropriate, but also really cathartic at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's possibly, part of the cultural background that Alexis Wright comes from, but also it's massively relevant to the characters in the Swan Book, as it's pretty bleak for virtually everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And by the end, everybody.
Yep. Yeah, no, nobody gets out of this book unscathed. It's just a not fun time for everyone.
No, and it does towards the end sort of hint at the idea that money and connections are no longer enough to keep you safe from being completely at the mercy of nature.
Mm-hmm. Which is something that we see happening currently, slowly, but,
Yeah, well, nature or drones or ballistic missiles, all sorts of things can really break down class barriers in interesting ways, let's just say.
So my journey with this book, I also read it for our book club that we're in together. But additionally, I also studied it. Last year, I was doing English literature courses, and this was one of the books that one of the subjects I took was studying. And because I'd fallen in love with it already in book club, I just felt the need to really focus on it in the course. I ended up writing my final essay on it. The essay I wrote on it was about intertextuality and decolonial theory and queer theory. Didn't actually have anything to do with disability theory, which is sort of more of what we're going into with this discussion. Although I will try to keep it low academic because this is not supposed to be an academic discussion. But there's so much that you can really dig into academically. We were limited to picking just 3 theories, and I was like, what about more? Because this book does so much.
Yeah, it's not a tremendously long book, but it's not a short book either. But like I said, it's incredibly dense and complex. There's really just so much going on, so much subtext buried inside, and there's so many points where, like, there'll be some oblique reference to Australian political history or classical mythology, or just really off the wall stuff that's really captivating.
It is. It really is. Even within the theories that I picked, because intertextuality is something that I really like, I specifically focused on the way that the Swan Book captured fairy tales, particularly around swans. And even that, it was like, I could write a whole PhD thesis on this, and I have to condense it to a 5,000 word essay. There was just so much in the text. So you are right that the book is a relatively ordinary length novel. It's about 330 pages in the version that I have. And that's about a regular sort of novel length, but it feels
pretty typical.
Yeah, it feels so much longer somehow. It feels huge on the inside.
Yes, the TARDIS book.
Yes. So on to sort of more of the topic of this podcast. This text is not explicitly about multiplicity. And it's hard to say whether or not it's intentionally about it either. As far as I can tell, Alexis Wright has never said anything about specifically this book or really any of her characters and their mental health issues. So it's impossible to tell how much of what is in this that I have sort of seen is intentionally in there. I do think that it's important to discuss these things respectfully and cautiously. As Alexis Wright is an Indigenous Australian author, the characters within the book, particularly the main character Oblivia, they are Indigenous Australian characters. And when it comes to things like psychology and diagnosis, these things tend to be very cultural. A lot of psychology, as we currently understand it, is based in Western cultural norms. There has been very little done in psychology in Australia to create any sort of frameworks for Indigenous cultures. And if you want to learn more about that, I would highly recommend the book Jilia by Tracy Westerman. It's a great resource about that sort of topic. So, for instance, one of the things that I picked up initially when I read it was the fact that Oblivia has these ghosts, these spirits that visit her. And I thought, you know, from my Western perspective, maybe this is one of those sort of symptoms. But as I learned more about how many different Indigenous cultures often have spirit visitations as a part of sorry time, which is sort of a grief time, it made sense that this is actually just kind of a regular part of the culture and wasn't actually supposed to be representative of anything psychologically symptomatic, really. Even though there is still a lot within the book that is obviously coming from a place of deep trauma for Oblivia. She sees the spirit of Belladonna, who is a white woman who raised her, the harbour master, and his monkey Rigoletto. So these are people and animals that Oblivia has been very close to. And so seeing them in spirit form after they have passed is not necessarily unusual within Indigenous cultures. There is something to be said about the fact that these spirits are not necessarily comforting. They're not necessarily nice to Oblivia, often calling her names and scaring her and telling her off. So whether or not this actually does fit into the normative experience is up for debate. I don't really think that we have much capacity to comment on that as we are not from those cultures. So, regardless, the spirits aspect is not something that is going to be a part of the discussion about the multiplicity in this book. So, with that aside, you might be thinking, what exactly is it in this book that makes it about multiplicity? Well, let's get into it and start off our discussion by talking about dissociation, which is interestingly, I feel like, portrayed in this book where it's not often portrayed in media. Even media that is explicitly about DID, which is dissociative identity disorder, often they don't really portray dissociation in any way, which is wild to me.
It's really the dissociation is kind of key to the whole thing.
It really is. So, one of the things I've written down here is that the text itself, the way that the book is written, is inherently dissociative. I don't know if you can sort of expand on that at all, James. Like, what do you feel about that sort of a statement?
So, I would say that the way that it's written, it's kind of like a stream of consciousness, but the consciousness is not, it's not sort of lucid consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like sleepwalking or being like half awake or something like that.
Yep.
There's sort of like a breakdown of what is and what isn't reality.
Yep, 100%. I agree with that. There's a lot of ways that this text breaks away from that traditional Western convention of storytelling, and I feel like the way that it's written in a very train of thought, flowy way, where things are just sort of happening and figuring out exactly when and where they're happening, whether they are really happening or whether they are ideas or paranoias or something that is, you know, a thought activity that somebody is having. Impossible to tell.
Completely impossible. I don't think that you're supposed to be able to reliably determine what's going on.
No.
I think that the way that it's written is designed to mirror the way that Oblivia experiences reality,
mm-hmm.
in a sort of like fragmented and non-linear way.
Mm-hmm. I agree. There's also the fact that speech is italicized rather than within quotation marks, which I know is not necessarily something that is only done within this book. There are other books that do that. But there's something about not using quotation marks for speech that gives it a really dissociated and distant feeling, particularly because often the italics are used for internal thoughts as well. So it's impossible to say whether something has been said out loud or whether somebody is just thinking it.
Yeah, and I think that it also diminishes the structure of the novel text in such a way that it sort of mirrors a breakdown in the structure of reality.
Yeah, so it's not just Oblivia internally breaking down, but the world is also kind of breaking down around her at the same time.
Yes, when I was reading it, which, this highly recommend the audiobook. It was fantastic. This is actually perfectly suited for audiobooks. Towards the end, it felt like it's not like there's like a fog of war or stuff. It's like reality itself was just sort of like ceasing to be, where it's not immediately relevant to Oblivia.
Yeah, no, there's that whole scene where she's traveling and it almost feels like the world is disappearing behind her.
Yeah.
It's a really good book, just for that alone.
It really is. Honestly, I think puts a lot of sci-fi and fantasy authors, speculative fiction broadly as a whole, oeuvre, puts them to shame, because she didn't really set out to do their thing, but she ended up doing their thing better than almost any of them can do it.
Yeah.
Which is phenomenal.
So a lot of people do say that this book is difficult to read, and I know that when we did it for book club,
it is.
When we did it for book club, there were several people that hadn't finished it yet, because particularly that first section before anything is really actively happening, there's a lot of very circular talking, and it feels like nothing is really happening, which is true. There is stuff that's happening, but also at the same time, nothing is really happening. And even though there are actions that then happen, this sort of feeling of nothing is actually really happening, nothing is really changing, is pervasive throughout the book. And that's kind of just what dissociation is,
Yeah.
But I do know that first 75 pages is some of the most difficult for people to get through.
Oh, it's tremendously rough. I think it's effective in what it sets out to do, which is to shake your sense of reality, cause and effect, all these things, to the point where you can let the sort of rambling, dissociative story just sort of wash over you. Whereas, typically when you read a novel, it's going to explain things in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, no, this book doesn't care.
Instead of playing games with this book does not care. This book isn't about being the most exciting or engaging book you've read, but it makes you work to experience it in the way that I believe the author intended for you to experience it.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And again, it's not something that we can talk on a huge amount, but I do think that there's something to the fact that this is sort of representing the Indigenous Australian experience in a lot of ways, because I remember this is something that was talked about a lot in class when I studied this book in class, but dystopian futures is something that feels very natural to a lot of Indigenous Australians, because for them it's already happened. They've already had that big apocalyptic world-ending thing happen, and now they're living in a post-apocalyptic dystopian world which is like our post-colonial society.
Yeah, militarized police, mass surveillance, all that stuff, good old George Orwell stuff has been happening to Indigenous people since forever.
Mm-hmm. And even though this book is set in the future, it's basically just about the now.
Yes, which is a key fact about dystopian fiction that a lot of people need to keep in mind, is that it's not really about the future, it's about the present.
Mm-hmm. It's sort of just taking what is happening now to its obvious logical extreme.
Yeah.
And it is quite extreme, but also what has happened and what is currently happening in Indigenous populations is quite extreme. So
yeah, and with really no signs of it abating.
mm-hmm. It's one of those things where the fact that this is a book about Indigenous trauma, it's unfortunately the unescapable reality of Indigenous Australians is that they experience trauma as a day-to-day cycle.
Yeah. And, we've also seen other prominent examples of Indigenous people resisting despite, monumental oppression, such as in Palestine.
Mm-hmm. We just live in a terrible timeline.
We do, but the fact that people like us are upset about it and, able to be informed about it, able to communicate with other people about it. It is terrible, but, there's some good things.
Yeah. We gotta just keep hope alive.
Yeah. Doomerism is a really seductive trap, but it's a tar pit. You got to stay out of it.
Mm-hmm. Circling back around to the main character, Oblivia, who is central to this story, let's talk about the specific traits that she exhibits that feel, to me, multiple. And again, this is just sort of our interpretation. It's not necessarily going to be something that everybody sees. But there are a lot of hallmarks that she exhibits as somebody that could have dissociative identity disorder. So the easy early one that we learn right off the bat, it's not even foreshadowed at all. It's just stated from the get-go. She's experienced a lot of trauma. She's been through a lot of stuff. We don't see it directly in the text. It's not, which, even though there are a lot of traumatic things she goes through in the course of the book, the childhood trauma that she experiences is referenced but not shown, which I personally appreciate. I think that often when it comes to trauma depictions, people often think that they are doing a decent job at being respectful, but it usually sort of teeters into sensationalizing a little bit. But this book doesn't do that. It very much stays away from that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that for especially an Indigenous author, the things that are discussed in the book are not hypotheticals. They're things that happen.
Mm-hmm. So Oblivia is the identity that the main character adopts after the traumatic events, but then it's not her sort of this is where it can get a little bit messy to discuss. So it's maybe not the quote-unquote original identity or the original name that she was known by. It's not necessarily her legal name, but she does go by Oblivian Ethelene Oblivia, or something like that. She's always changing the order around a little bit, but mainly just Oblivia is how she refers to herself in her head. But it comes to light later on that her legal name, the name that she was given when she was born, may have been Emily Wake. And then she also gets a name when she is married off to Warren Finch, which is Ethel Finch, which is sort of that combination of, so he hears her sort of chosen name of Oblivion Ethelene and is like, well, Ethel is kind of a name, so let's take that one and put my last name with it. So that's sort of the name of the first lady that is married to Warren Finch is Ethel Finch. So you've kind of got this already confusion of identity going on.
Yeah, the part where she is renamed by Warren is, I think it's part of Warren being portrayed as sort of like a collaborator with white Australia, despite his Indigenous heritage and his, his activism and advocacy, he is still essentially colonizing Oblivia, in the same way that, white Australia, colonized the Indigenous, peoples.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. I've realized that we haven't given a whole lot of context around Warren, so I'm not sure if you would like to do that, because I know that you had a lot of thoughts about Warren when we read the book.
Yes. So Warren is a not especially subtle character in the sense that he's very clearly heavily inspired by Barack Obama, who had just started his second term as President of the United States when this book was published.
Mm-hmm.
And he is from a nearby community to the people of the lake where Oblivia is from. And he was treated as basically a chosen one from his earliest days.
He's got a very Jesus figure to him.
Yeah.
I think that they might call him, I don't know if they call him Jesus, but they call him something equivalent at some point.
Oh yeah, they call him like an Aboriginal Messiah or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
And they also do compare him to Obama.
Also, interestingly though, because he is half Indigenous and half white, that's also weirdly used both in his favor but also against him. People both love him and hate him for that aspect of his personhood.
Which I feel like that's a thing that happens.
Yeah, 100%. It is a thing that happens.
Yeah. Because, people with different ancestry are treated differently. That's essentially the core of racism, and that's what it is. I think it's perfectly legitimate for people from marginalized groups to leverage their to obtain any sort of leverage against their oppressors as they can. But oftentimes this is done at the expense of other people in the community, and that's very much the case with Warren Finch. He has the army kind of ethnically cleanse the people of the lake.
Mm-hmm.
It kicks everyone out and blows everything up.
Because he specifically comes looking for Oblivia because he has already been, they had an arranged marriage between their families. So he specifically seeks her out to marry her. He doesn't romance her in any way. He is just this is going to help my political career because it ties me back to my my Indigenous heritage.
Yeah, and also he convinces himself that he's doing something altruistic by taking Oblivia away from the lake, which admittedly is a shithole, but she has autonomy when she's living by herself, and Warren takes it away from her.
Mm-hmm. There's a quote here about Warren Finch that says he was post-racial, possibly even post-Indigenous, which I thought was really funny.
Yes, I think that is also another Barack Obama reference there. You did hear a lot of talk back in those days about, is this the beginning of post-racial America? Which did also sound ridiculous back then.
Mm-hmm. I found the quote that I was looking for that is about Warren. And it says, "Around he drove with his friends down every street, the back roads and by roads, sizing up everybody who was a black, thank you, checking out the despair, mentally adding up the figures and checking it twice, and deciding like he was white that it was all hopeless, nothing would help, and driving on." So from his introduction, there's an emphasis that he is acting on behalf of colonial Australia.
Yeah, he's a sort of King Herod figure in that respect, being installed by the Empire to oversee the natives.
100%. So circling back, when he essentially kidnaps Oblivia and forces her to marry him, gives her a new name, he is essentially, as you said, colonizing her and inflicting more trauma upon her through taking her away from her home, destroying her home, and holding her captive.
Yes. Which also, another fact about Warren Finch, he knew about the assault that had happened to Oblivia because he had a newspaper article about it that he'd cut out and kept.
Yeah, I don't have the quote on me for this one either, but it was a quote that went along the lines of, he felt like he owned her story.
Yeah.
Which is super messed up.
Hmm.
So yeah, there's a lot of interesting dynamics there, but a lot of it sort of does revolve around the fact that Oblivia does not have autonomy. She doesn't have autonomy in any part of her life. When she is a child, it's taken away from her because she is horrifically gang raped and left for dead. And then as she's growing up, her autonomy is controlled by Belladonna, who becomes a bit of a parental figure. And even though Belladonna tries to do well by her, Belladonna has her own issues. Belladonna does at one point try to give Oblivia back to her family, and her family was like, that's not ours. There's no point within the bulk of this book where Oblivia feels like she has autonomy over herself, which I think is another really important aspect to this, because she doesn't feel like she has control over her identity. So there's a really interesting quote when Oblivia and Warren first meet that I think really speaks to this, which goes, "You are Emily Wake, or are you somebody else?" he asked, looking at her again as though she could be of mild interest to him. She did not know the name, never heard it before. It occurred to her that this stranger could tell her who she was, the identity she sought by searching through the words written on a page. M.E.O. Wake. She tried to say that her name was Oblivia Ethelina Bolivian, although generally she thought Emu Awake was something someone had said to her once. So this is sort of Warren coming to her going, "You're Emily, right? Or are you somebody else?" And she is unable to answer him. So something that we haven't said yet is that Oblivia is unable to talk. She is mute throughout the majority of this book. And that occurred when she experienced her childhood trauma. She hasn't spoken since. So her not having any autonomy over her voice, not being able to speak, not being able to have any autonomy over her identity is a huge aspect of this book. She is looking at Warren and going, can this guy tell me who I am? And then he kind of does. He doesn't really take on the Emily Wake aspect, but he sort of gives her a new identity through that Ethel Finch name.
Yeah, it's kind of like how the British would roll up and just name somewhere after themselves.
You'd be like, look, I know that your name is Emily Wake, and it might be something else because you might have chosen something else for yourself, but now you're Finch because I said so.
Yeah.
So more than this, so this is sort of the beginning part of this, but to further this point, there do actually seem to be distinct identity states that don't share cognitive awareness between them. So we get almost entirely throughout the book the perspective of Oblivia, the girl who experienced trauma, but there also seems to be this other state that is Ethel Finch, the First Lady of Australia, the woman married to Warren Finch, and she's sort of like this perfect figure that Oblivia sees and recognizes outside of herself. She actually sees her on TV at one point because she's locked up in the apartment that Warren put her in, which is called the People Palace. And she's like on the penthouse level, and it's very Rapunzel-esque. There's a lot of fairy tale stuff going on within the book. But while she's locked up there, she watches TV and she sees herself and is like, what on earth? But it's also not her. Like, she looks at this person and she's like, that looks like me, but it also doesn't look like me because this person is like super like glammed up and wearing suits and looking super professional, and like, I've never looked like that before in my life. What the hell?
Yeah, it makes you wonder if she was, I mean, like, clearly she has no autonomy. That's all been stripped away from her. But in a sort of like strict literal sense, was she confined to the tower at all times, or was she just completely checking out any time when Warren came to take her to some fundraiser or whatever?
Well, that's the thing. This is sort of the hinge of my theory here, is that this is when she would dissociate. This is when Oblivia would go internal, and Ethel Finch would come forward and play the perfect First Lady character. And that was her identity. But the two of them do not have any sort of internal recognition of each other. They don't know each other. They would, like, she literally sees herself on TV and goes, I don't know that woman.
Yeah.
So there's like a quote from Warren that really does emphasize this when he says, your business is to stay here and be my wife. And so he gives her a role. And my interpretation of that is that there is because this is all very traumatic, what's going on. She's been taken away from her home. She's been forced to marry this man. All of these things have happened in quick succession, not that long ago as well, before Warren came along. Belladonna died as well, so her caregiver died. So all of these things sort of happened in rapid succession. She's being re-traumatized. So it would make sense for there to be a significant identity split here, or a reemergence of alters that may have gone dormant. At the end of the day, within a system, there's not really any way of clearly telling whether, alter that has just appeared is one that recently split or has been dormant for a long period of time, except if they had previously been around quite a lot. So, it gets messy when you try to dig too deep into that. But he has basically said, here is your role. And so there has been part of her that has taken that idea and gone, yep, got it. It's a role. I can do that,
Yeah.
There's also a couple of other quotes that relate to this ideal TV version of herself that this Ethel Finch, the First Lady character. Again, we don't get anything from Ethel. We don't even know. So there's a lot of speculation within the text itself. Is it actually Oblivia, or have they got like a body double for her? Is it like that, a big conspiracy theory where they just got somebody that looked a lot like her? And it's like, that is wild. But also, anything could happen in this book. Who knows?
Yes, although I will say in that situation, there's someone else who could have used a body double a little bit more.
We'll get to that. So there's a quote that says, then Oblivia would again feel an excitable urge exploding in her stomach to rush back to the apartment in double quick time before dawn, for she was always hoping to become the television wife, to see herself as greatly loved with the jubilant politician husband. And there's also like a continuation to that. To actually experience what it felt like to be beside someone like this, and which would prove once and for all that it really was her in the picture, that she did feel this love that she saw on the television. And there's this like interesting dynamic going on there where she sees herself and she's like, that is me on the television, but it's also not me, but I want to be that. Like, you can see there's this battle going on inside her where she doesn't actually want to be married to Warren, but she also does at the same time. She's got this huge cognitive dissonance going on there.
Yeah. I think it's related to the trauma, her sort of inability to recognize a dangerous situation if it's not immediately life-threatening.
Mm-hmm. But also at the same time, she is suspicious of everything. She doesn't trust anyone.
No, and I think that the fact that she knows that she can't trust Warren is kind of helpful because it removes a little bit of doubt.
Mm-hmm. There's also a quote from later on, and this one starts with a comment from the spirit of the harbour master, which is, again, somebody that Oblivia knew when she lived at the lake. So he starts off by saying, she is the pretend wife, not you at all. But Oblivia wouldn't believe it, could feel it in her bones that she was the television wife. So there's something inside her that is very clearly resonating with this other being that she is seeing, even though she has no memory of ever doing these things. She has no recollection emotionally of these things, but there's something in her that's like, I know that that's me. And that is often the way it is in DID, in multiplicity, is that you might not have recollection of that thing happening. You might not have the memories, you might not have the emotional connection to it, but there is still a connection that you have made there, because this is still something that is internally inside of you. So even though you have compartmentalized it away in a very severe way, it is something that is still there. And so there's a weird recognition that you get. It's difficult to describe. But when I read this, I was like, yeah, I feel you.
It sounds difficult to live.
Yeah. Well, you know, I did not have it nearly as bad as Oblivia did.
No. She really outperformed everyone there. Basically, by the end, turned into like almost like a final girl, sort of like in a horror movie kind of thing.
She does have final girl vibes.
She does, especially like the one line of dialogue that she has. She actually talks.
So right at the end.
Yeah. Sort of like what's that character's name? Furiosa from Mad Max Fury Road.
Yeah, she's just like had so many people controlling her autonomy for so long. And right at the end of the book, she's like, actually, no.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of the only one who knows what the hell they're doing, so I'm going to take charge here.
But with regards to this television version of her, in my mind, from a sort of even an objective stance, this makes a lot of sense as a DID reading, as you've got sort of these very archetypical two identities that are being balanced here, which is Oblivia, who is a trauma holder, versus this TV version, Ethel Finch, which is the functional, apparently normal part. So that's sort of very, you know, a little bit almost stereotypical within systems, is you've got somebody that holds the trauma and holds all of the emotions, and then somebody that does day-to-day functioning, that keeps it all together and looks presentable to the crowd. And it's just sort of taken those ideas to very big extremes. There's also, in my mind, and this might be way off base, but again, this whole theory might be way off based on what the author intended, who's to say. But again, you know, maybe we follow Roland Barthes and go death of the author. I would never, but, you know, we could if we wanted to. You know, the interpretation is entirely in the hands of the reader.
Yeah, you decide what those letters mean, actually.
You decide. But there's, in my mind, hints that the swans, because Oblivia is highly connected to swans, if you couldn't tell from the title, of the Swan Book, she has got a deep connection with these black swans that gather around her. And in my mind, they are alters. They are other states of being. And the reason that I think this is because of this specific quote, well, among others, but this specific quote I feel like really summarizes it. She believed it was her job. It was the only reason why she stayed and had not become a permanent television wife. So, in my mind, my reading of that phrase is that these swans who have followed her from the lake to the People's Palace are fragments. They are these highly fragmented parts of her that she needs to look after. That is her role in this system, is to look after these highly fragmented parts. And that's why she can't permanently be the perfect TV wife. So yeah, that's my theory there.
There's also that interesting parallel between Oblivia, who has the swans as a constant in her life, and Warren, who in his early life with his indigenous community, he would dance with the brolgas, large, terrifying birds.
I did write extensively about the connection between what the swans meant versus what the brolgas meant for both Warren and Oblivia, and how they related to colonization. There's a lot there. It's deeply interesting, particularly if you start to get into the history behind Swan Maiden fairy tales, which is what I was heavily inspired by, because they actually originate, if you go back far enough, in China as crane bird fairy tales. And if you look at a crane bird and you look at a brolga, there's a lot more similarities there than between a swan and a crane bird.
Yeah, brolga's kind of like a big, clearly still a dinosaur crane.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like on performance-enhancing drugs.
So yeah, there's so much in this book. It's impossible to capture everything. And these are just the interpretations that we are pulling out. There's definitely so many more that somebody else might see. You know, we haven't, in my opinion, barely scratched the surface of interpretations.
Oh, no, absolutely not.
So just to round out this section about why I think that Oblivia within the text is multiple, specifically, is that she does lose a lot of time. Like, we cannot keep her timeline straight. She doesn't know when or where she is, and neither do we. Ever.
No. It's impossible to tell even when it is. At certain points, it'll imply that it's set in, like, the 21st century, and other parts it implies maybe it's the 23rd or 24th century. It's very vague, and I think that contributes to the overall sense that you have no bearing on the real world.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes, you're very unable to ground anywhere within this text. You could basically read this whole text and come away with it and go, I have no idea what happened, because that's how it feels.
Yeah.
Like, you might pick up some things and you might be like, I think this happened, but I don't know. And to be fair, Oblivia probably is feeling the same exact way through the entire thing, because she doesn't know what's really going on, and she's like, I think that this happened, but I don't know.
Yeah, and then, you know, if you're talking to someone about it, and they mention something that's in the book, you're like, oh, yeah, it did happen, didn't it?
It is always interesting to me what things stand out in the book for other people, because it's always something different to what stands out to me.
Oh, yeah.
So, just to continue on with this multiple theory, I think that we do sort of get an inner world. So again, it's not an explicit, potentially not even an intentional representation. But in DID fiction and reality, a lot of systems have internal worlds where the alters essentially exist when they're not fronting in the body. So we don't get any reference ever that Oblivia is in an inner world or an internal world, but she's not really aware, so how would she know? But in my opinion, there are a lot of indications that things are happening in an inner world, but who's to say? Who's to say about anything in this book? But I have seen in a lot of different systems that there can be a lot of things that are sort of internalized about the external world in inner worlds. So often they are places that are either familiar or based on things that you have experienced in real life. I have heard of systems that have essentially like entire cities inside of their head that like are populated, and there's buildings and things like that. So inner worlds can be vast and all very different, but a lot of them do tend to have some basis on, like, in reality, in real structures, because you have to remember that DID is generally formed in young childhood. So these things these ideas about what reality is sort of start to really cement into your brain at a young age. But they are also flexible. You know, things can change over time. Your understanding can change over time. So in my opinion, there are essentially two places that could indicate Oblivia's internal world. You've got the penthouse apartment in the People's Palace. Again, it's a very Rapunzel-like situation. She's locked in a tower. And there's also the hull of the boat that she lived on. So, you know, that was sort of her safe place. And then this, like, locked in a tower is less of a safe place, but feels accurate to what she is going through at the time. Because she does feel locked in a tower. She feels unable to escape the current situation she is in, which is she is being forced to be Warren Finch's wife. And so it would make sense that her internal world changed to reflect that reality of her feeling trapped. By that same logic, the ever-present swans may be a signal of her inner world, as the swans are a really ingrained part of her own internal story and internal mythology. So we didn't talk much about it before, but at the beginning part of the book where Oblivia is living with Belladonna's absolute favorite thing is swans. And that's why Oblivia has a connection with them, is because Belladonna absolutely filled her mind with stories about swans. A lot of critics have talked about how Belladonna colonized Oblivia's mind with the idea of swans, which is sort of an interesting idea to think about and deconstruct and look at its progression over the course of the book as well.
Yeah, I think that there's possibly something there, although I think that's possibly a little bit unfair to Belladonna, because she didn't go there to do a colonialism. She went there because she had to escape her home.
Yeah.
And she didn't go to, like, one of the big cities where, like, you know, the power structure of white Australia is. No, she went to this indigenous community made out of, like, rusting, sunken ships.
Yeah. Although whether or not that was a conscious choice is up for debate. There's a lot of interesting stuff.
Well, that's kind of the point, though. Like, if she gets dumped there.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of interesting stuff with Belladonna where it's like there's a lot to tease out there that I personally don't feel fully equipped to do, you know?
Yeah, I think possibly there's something to do there with the Syrian refugee crisis, which had kicked off by 2013.
Yeah, so there's a explicit sort of reference to the fact that Belladonna, even though she's like white European, is a boat person, which if you are not Australian, that is a derogatory term for essentially people who are immigrating to Australia through non-official bureaucratic ways.
It's essentially the same as when Americans call undocumented immigrants illegals.
Yeah. We call them boat people here. It's horrible.
Yeah. There are some diaspora groups in Australia have sort of like, you know, sought to reclaim that, in particular the Vietnamese and Cambodian communities, because they were the original boat people, unless you want to get sort of cheeky about it and say the British.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. That's what I think this book is doing by calling Belladonna a boat person, though. Yes,
yeah. They're not. Alexis Wright isn't saying that Belladonna is Captain Cook.
It's an interesting dichotomy of, like, you know, the first and last Europeans both arrived on boats, but, you know, the political climate in which they did that in is vastly different.
Yes.
through all of this conversation, I think we can both say it's undeniable that Belladonna is the reason that Oblivia is so obsessed with swans. Like, I think that's undeniable.
I mean, there were also swans around.
There were swans around, but Belladonna is the one that put the story of swans in Oblivia.
Yeah.
So it became a part of her internal narrative about herself, because it was Belladonna's internal narrative. And again, this sort of comes into this idea that Oblivia does not have her own autonomy. She is looking to other people to tell her who she is as a person.
Yeah.
And the way that Belladonna does it is through the swans, which is why in this theory that I have created around Oblivia and multiplicity, I think that the swans are these sort of fragment altars that hold emotions, that hold like these ideas and feelings and fragments of identity for Oblivia. Another interesting thing to maybe talk about with regards to this, it's a little bit more of a looser idea, but it's the relationships that Oblivia forms. So throughout the book, we have said she doesn't talk, she's mute, due to the traumatic experiences that she's had, which makes, building relationships difficult for her, as well as the fact that she is suspicious of everyone. She doesn't trust anyone, but she does build like short-term relationships with people. On occasion, there are the genies that she sort of gets a little bit close to, and then they immediately disappear. So she struggles to develop strong long-term relationships with human people, which in my mind is interesting because she does develop really strong relationships with non-human people, like the swans and the spirit of Rigoletto, the monkey that was previously owned by the harbour master. Even though Rigoletto, the spirit of Rigoletto, he does like verbalize things to her, which is not, to my knowledge, something that the actual Rigoletto monkey would have done. But again, who knows in this book,
Yeah.
But it is interesting to me that, sure, she sees the spirit of Belladonna and the spirit of the harbour master and the spirit of Rigoletto. So obviously she has relationships with Belladonna and the harbour master. These are probably her strongest human relationships outside of Warren. But they are mean to her, largely, even in spirit form. Whereas Rigoletto is probably the nicest spirit that she encounters. Like, he's generally pretty nice to her, wants to protect her, doesn't want bad things to happen to her. He's the least antagonistic towards her, which is interesting to me. All of this to say, this isn't necessarily an argument necessarily towards multiplicity, but it does sort of, in my mind, add to the idea that there is a neurodivergence within Oblivia. I think that it's probably like something that could undoubtedly be said. She is not neuronormal.
Oh no.
She has some sort of neurodiversity, whether it is, because of the trauma or not. The way that her mind functions, the way that she connects with people is different. And multiplicity is a kind of neurodivergence. So there's a very vague connection I'm making there. But she does sort of have this outsider nature to her. There's a quote from the book that says, "She feasted on a plague of outsidedness," with regards to describing Oblivia, which is a wild set of words, but it does very much capture what Oblivia is like in relationships, in that she doesn't have them because she's an outsider. And people look at her and go, she's not like us, just like inherently. There's also the fact that people don't necessarily try to form relationships with her that hard. They don't try that much to form a relationship with her outside of how useful she can be. So,
yeah, access to her husband.
So for Warren, it's obviously like a political career move that he has made. The interesting one to me, again, I don't feel overly equipped to talk too much about it, but Belladonna, the fact that she keeps Oblivia, I don't think it's necessarily all because she's just very altruistic and wants to look after this young girl. I think it's specifically because Oblivia is happy to sit there and listen to her stories and not tell her to shut up. Because that's something that Belladonna finds very frustrating, is that she's like, I've traveled all this way and I have so many amazing stories to impart on you people and nobody wants to hear them. And then she comes across Oblivia and Oblivia is happy to just sit and listen. And Belladonna is like, finally, an audience.
Yeah, finally someone who appreciates me.
Mm-hmm. So at the end of the day, all of her close relationships are people that are using her for their own gain. So she doesn't have a great time with people, but she has a great time with animals. And interestingly, one of the sort of necessary parts diagnostically for DID is that you have a poor attachment to your primary caregiver. And whether you would like to consider Belladonna Oblivia's primary caregiver or the parents that she used to have that rejected her after her trauma, that's like, you know, both sides of that, bad attachment, you know? She was just set up to, in my opinion, be multiple if her brain was inherently wired that way. So I think that all of these things add to the argument in their own little way. So that's sort of my main thesis argument. Whether or not you believe that I've made a good enough argument, that's up to you as an individual listener. But we're going to move on to talking about problematic tropes now, because regardless of whether it's intentional or unintentional, most depictions of multiplicity come with problematic tropes. So because it's not explicit, it doesn't come with a lot of the hallmark ones. However, there is one big one that I feel like every single multiple, every time it comes up, is like fully head and hands. Why is this happening again? It's the fact that there is a suspicion that Oblivia has murdered someone. Specifically that she murdered Warren. And the text does not confirm or deny it. Which is a bit of a problem in my opinion.
Yeah, it's one of those unfortunate things that you really don't want to come up in the depictions of DID, but I do think that it is handled a lot better than your typical depiction of DID. Assuming, of course, that this is, which, you know, is completely up in the air and we'll probably never know.
Yeah, no, that's the thing. I think that it's DID. But whether it's intentional and whether what I'm seeing is like just what I want to see, who knows? But there is this quote from the text, because again, this is almost entirely from Oblivia's perspective. But there's a quote that says, "She feels terrified because they will think she has killed him. She does not remember, does not know what has happened anymore." So she has this fear in herself because she does not know. She hasn't enough awareness to know that she is not entirely connected with reality. That, especially because she has seen herself on TV and goes, I don't remember doing that. Like, she has this awareness that, you know, sometimes she might act and do things without an awareness that she's doing them. And so it makes sense in a way that when this assassination happens, she's like, I guess it could have been me. Who's to say? And I think within somebody who's going through that, as a multiple, I don't think that that's an unfounded fear to have. It's sort of one of those things where the fact that she has the fear, I don't necessarily think is a bad thing. It's the fact that the text doesn't explicitly deny it that I sort of find a bit problematic, but it would be hard for the text to explicitly deny it because of the nature of the text is to not explicitly say anything.
Yes.
So while this does play into that trope a little bit, a lot of it is sort of assumed to be just Oblivia's internal paranoia about the situation. The fact that she can't be certain in herself. There doesn't seem to really be any indication that anybody else is suspicious of her, or that anybody actually cares whether or not she did it, which is interesting. So there's a passage within one of the very late parts of the book that discusses this in some detail. Part of the quote goes, "The girl thought the genies had come back into her life disguised as middle-aged men who now suspected her of killing her husband. These security men sat around the cab of the truck and acted like Supreme Court judges." So at the time of this quote, Oblivia is traipsing around, like being traipsed around, in a Woolworths truck with the corpse of Warren Finch, which is one of the more comical parts of the book, is that the government does not want to bury Warren Finch, does not want to admit that he's dead, so kind of takes his dead body on tour in a Woolworths truck.
Well, it's not just that they're, in denial that this important politician is dead. It's also, this guy was the most glad-handing social climber that ever lived, so let him do that in the afterlife. Let's truck his body around Australia and let everyone come out and pay their respects. I think that there's a passage that talks about how everybody felt like they had a right to what was going to happen to his body because he was the president for everyone. Therefore, everyone should get a say, and everybody should be able to pay their respects, and everybody should own a part of Warren Finch, which is kind of what he signed up for. It is. It's sort of like a Faustian bargain that he made where he was going to have comfort and success and fame and life, and then his body will be used as a puppet for the rest of time.
Mm-hmm. This part of the text, Oblivia is sort of agonizing over whether or not she's killed Warren Finch, whether or not this is on her or not, because she has recognized she's not entirely in touch with what she has and hasn't done in her life. She doesn't have full awareness of her actions. But this scene with the genies, the middle-aged men that suspect her of killing her husband, is heavily implied to be entirely in her mind. That these men are not actually there, because it's just supposed to be her, Warren's body, and the truck drivers. Those are the only people that are physically supposed to be present in this scene.
I think that it was likely that they were real and they didn't stick around, but that they weren't genies and they weren't judging her. They were just there because they were paid to be there. Because,
they were
security details for politicians aren't just for the politicians themselves, and they don't end for the politician's family if that politician dies.
True.
Like, the families will still be under protection to some degree. And I think that the fact that they bugger off and go elsewhere may be related to the fact that society's collapsing. And they're like, well, okay, I know it's my job, but like the paychecks aren't coming in anymore, and I need to be there for my family because their house is underwater.
Yeah, no, there's like a huge overarching, underarching through line.
I would say it's overarching, and it's sort of it's implied that like climate change has already done a whole lot of damage, and then towards the end of the book, it continues to escalate and accelerate.
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, this is all of this is happening throughout essentially the massive climate collapse. So the fact that like there's any politics happening at all is interesting. My theory of this is that, again, it's something that Oblivia is internally agonizing over, but nobody is necessarily externally accusing her.
Yeah.
So this quote, this page continues, and it says, "Unquenched, uncontrolled yearning that lasted thousands of kilometers, with Oblivia tormenting herself with the question, did she or did she not kill her husband? And was she just chasing the Hair King that day?" The driver pulled his cap further down on his eyebrows. It was academic to him. He was not wishing for anything. didn't care if she had an alibi or not, or whether it was easier to believe she had killed her husband than to believe she was chasing a hare. He became lead-footed to cure any urge for wishing, thinking, or yearning, pressing harder on the accelerator and sending the semi flying along the road. So there's like an implication there that the truck driver is just there to do a job, and he doesn't actually care about the minutiae of the emotional aspect at all.
Yeah, like, it seems that his attitude is something like he doesn't care, or like he feels like it's none of his business if Oblivia killed Warren. It's sort of like, hey, that's between them.
Yeah. And that's the thing. It's either nobody actually suspects her, or if they do, they don't care. Which is an interesting way to take that sort of thing. Like this massive political assassination, and nobody suspects the wife. Which, like, either is implying...
Well, they do, but they don't give a shit.
Yeah. Which is either implying that, yeah, there's, like, something...
Like, they know what Warren is like in his personal life, and they know that he's basically kidnapped this person.
Yeah, and it's like, it could go either way. It doesn't really point to, is this sort of like saying, actually, it was okay for her to do it if she did? Or is it saying, no, she didn't do it, she just is paranoid? It's impossible to say.
Maybe his head just did that.
Yeah, maybe it was natural.
Yeah.
Just natural gunshot wound.
Yeah.
Was it a gun? I don't even know.
I think they said that he got shot like 3 to 5 times or something like that. Which, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I could believe that Oblivia did that as much as anyone else, but also, like, you know, I know what Warren did to her, and therefore, like,
yeah,
you know,
it becomes messy because,
yeah,
like everything in this book, it's messy because we don't know actually what happened.
Yeah, and there's like a lot of sort of surrealism going on around that because Oblivia is sort of cognizant enough of what's happening around her to be sort of like bewildered by the way that Warren is being essentially canonized after his death.
Mm-hmm. I think that there's also a part towards the end where it talks about how he would be posthumously charged with something. I don't even know what it was, but something.
Oh, yeah, it was like a whole lot of, like, corruption.
Yeah. No, and it's like, of course.
Yeah. Like, he was living that life of, like, jet-setting luxury on the Prime Minister's on the President's salary? I don't think so.
It's so funny how you said Prime Minister because it's just such a natural thing to think of in Australian politics.
Yeah.
We don't have a president here.
No, we've got King Charles and his embarrassing brother.
To be fair, they're the royal family. They're all the embarrassing brother.
Oh, yes, but, you know, Andrew is a little bit more embarrassing than your average royal.
So that's essentially the evidence that I have about Oblivia's plurality and the discussion around problematic tropes, which, again, there weren't very many because this wasn't a explicit representation, and yet still managed to just slip one in there, which, you know, always a bit fun. But again, it's one of those books where you could read it and go, I don't know that Warren actually died. So I think that there's evidence to say that Oblivia is plural, that Oblivia has the ID, potentially, if you want to use the diagnostic terminology. The text never explicitly states it. It's all speculation on my part, but I think that the evidence is, you know, relatively sound for a book that is so ungrounded. But in and of itself, I feel like that's evidence of it. So when it comes to the Swan Book, all we have is speculation. It's all up in the air. Nothing is confirmed within the text.
And that's how Alexis Wright likes it.
You figure it out.
Genuinely, that does seem to be the attitude that comes across in the book, which I really admire.
All right. So, based on the things that I have presented to you, the things that we've discussed, James, how would you rate the Swan Book for multiplicity representation?
So I must confess, I haven't consumed the backlog of this podcast, so I am kind of flying blind here. I can see on the notes what you've given it.
You don't read ahead. That's cheating.
Absolutely. I'm so sorry.
You're copying my work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I kind of have to in a sense because, as I was saying, I feel like I'm missing a little bit of perspective and context on some of the other stuff. However, that being said, I think 4 out of 5 is probably a fair rating. I think you make a pretty good case as to the presence of multiplicity in the text, and given that, I think it is a good example of DID representation.
Thank you. I think that having you on is an interesting sounding board for this sort of thing, because you can, and this is like, you know, we all have subjective opinions, but as somebody that doesn't experience multiplicity, you sort of have a bit more of an objective perspective that you can bring, where you can tell me, actually, this is something that everybody experiences, you know? Because when you experience multiplicity,
with caution, because I don't think I'm the most normal person.
Well, yeah, no, obviously. But there's some aspect of when you live with multiplicity, you live with multiplicity. So to some extent, this is your normal. It's difficult to look outside of that and figure out what of your experiences actually overlap with non-multiples to some extent, because everything is just sort of how you experience it. You can't necessarily easily pass out this is a symptom of dissociative identity disorder versus this is just part of being human, you know?
Yeah.
So having you as a sounding board, having you in this conversation, I think adds an interesting perspective of, you know, at some point you could be like, actually, that's not just a multiplicity thing. So, like, yeah, was there anything in here where when I was, like, talking or making an argument that you were like, I
don't think so, because I think that clearly there's, you know, neurodivergence happening. There's a lot of trauma happening. There's a breakdown of reality and the world is ending. But having both a very sort of like close-up look at specific things in the text, but also like a really broad view of the text as a whole, I think it's a pretty good fit.
Brilliant. That gives me some validation. I do think that there's a lot of solid evidence. Again, like, I am biased here because this is a book that I'm a little bit obsessed with, but I do think that there's a lot of evidence, and I certainly felt some of my own experience being reflected within the text, even if it's not explicitly about DID. So personally, I give the Swan Book a 4.5 out of 5 for multiplicity representation. For me, the only ground that it really loses marks on is the fact that it's not explicit, and the suspicion of Oblivia killing Warren, which is that problematic trope of people with multiplicity being murderers. But there's a lot of nuance to unpack there. Like we said, who's to say anything concretely with regards to this text? There's nothing that we can say, this definitely happened in the Swan Book, other than there were words on a page.
It rained a lot.
See, did it though? Or did it rain in Oblivia's mind a lot?
I think it probably happened in both.
Who's to say? Who's to say? This was sort of a discussion on multiplicity in the Swan Book, but I'd love to hear your thoughts as the listeners. Have you read the Swan Book? Do you think it represents multiplicity? Do you think we're completely off base with this one? Do you think it's supposed to be representing something else or everything else? What isn't it representing at the end of the day? But if you have any comments or suggestions for topics to cover on MeDIDa, or if you'd like to be a guest on an episode, you can contact us on medidapodcast@gmail.com. You can also subscribe to the YouTube channel Avoticat, where we will be uploading episodes to listen to there. And you can also find us on Instagram under MeDIDa Podcast and on Facebook as me.didea. Thank you very much to James for being our guest today to discuss the Swan Book.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And I'm sure that we will have you on again in the future.
Absolutely.
I've been Avoticat. This has been MeDIDa, and it is time to switch out.